When I was a kid, my grandmother, a proud Cherokee woman, would tell us stories about the spirits that lived in our apartment. My mom would laugh them off, calling them just old family tales, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about Granny's voice, the way it softened when she spoke of the unseen, that made me believe there might be more to it. Her quiet confidence held a weight I couldn't quite understand, but it stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Granny's house smelled of cedar wood and the faint, sweet tongue of sweetgrass. To anyone else, it might have been a comforting scent, a reminder of ancestral rituals, but to me, it was something else, something ancient. It was like stepping into a place where time had no meaning, where the past and present tangled together, coiled in the very air. In the evenings, when the light from the windows faded and the world outside became quiet, the house would settle into itself. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper and framed old photographs, seemed to breathe with the house. They creaked and groaned as though the house was alive, shifting beneath us, holding memories too heavy for words. It was in the stillness of those nights, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that Granny would gather us in the living room. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a few candles, the shadows stretching long across the floor. The furniture, worn leather with patches of age, seemed to sag under the weight of countless stories. It was there, in the quiet shadows, that Granny would sit us down, her voice low and steady as she spun her tales. "They're mostly harmless spirits from long ago," she'd say, her voice carrying a warmth that always made me feel both comforted and uneasy at once. Her smile was kind, but there was a depth in her eyes that made me think she knew more than she let on. "They're just here to remind us of things forgotten," but to me, those words only made the space feel smaller, the air heavier. Every creak of the old house felt like it was holding something back, something waiting to be noticed. I often found myself staring at the corners of the room, wondering if something was watching me from the dark spaces where the walls met the ceiling, or behind the curtains that fluttered faintly in the draft. It wasn't so much a fear as it was an unsettling awareness, a feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. When Granny would leave the room or turn her back, the quiet would shift. The silence would become thick, like it was waiting for something. The faintest movement in the shadows would catch my eye, too swift, too subtle to be sure of, but always just there. And I'd feel it then, a coldness at the back of my neck, like fingers brushing against my skin in a way that wasn't quite natural. I'd freeze, trying not to let it show, but inside, my heart would race, and I'd hold my breath, afraid that if I made a sound, the shadows would creep closer. I never told anyone about it. I didn't want to seem silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something watched, something old, lingering at the edge of my vision. At night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, I'd lie in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to push away the unease that crept in with the dark. I'd whisper softly, "Is anyone there?" My voice felt small in the stillness, almost like an invitation to something that wasn't supposed to answer. But the answer was always silence. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Sometimes, it was just the shadows that seemed to move, shifting with a life of their own. Other times, I'd hear whispers that weren't my own, soft and unintelligible, brushing the edges of my consciousness. They never seemed to come from anywhere, but they lingered, like echoes from a forgotten time, bouncing off the walls in the quiet of the night. And then, there was the shuffle, the sound of slow, dragging feet that would echo in the back of my mind. It was faint at first, like the sound of someone walking down a long hallway, but always just out of reach. It wasn't until I closed my eyes that I could almost hear it, in the silence of the room, just beyond the edges of the familiar. The dragging sound wasn't the wind or the house settling, it was something else, something with weight, with purpose. It felt as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I didn't want to acknowledge it. I didn't want to know. So I lay there in the dark, pretending I didn't hear it, letting the sound wash over me like a distant memory, a half-forgotten dream. Yet, even as I tried to push it all away, I could feel it just behind my eyelids, pressing in from the corners of my room. And so I began to imagine things. Whispers that weren't my own, shadows that flickered when I wasn't looking, the slow, dragging shuffle that I could never quite place. One evening, as Granny was telling one of her stories, she mentioned how her grandmother had experienced similar things in her time. Her voice softened, eyes far away, as if she were tracing the threads of a memory buried deep in the past. "Spirits don't just come and go," she said, her voice a low whisper that seemed to vibrate in the still air. "They've always been here, walking in the spaces between the living and the dead, just waiting for us to notice them." That struck me, the thought that something so ancient could linger in the spaces around us, unnoticed yet always present. It made me think about how old the world was, how many secrets it held, secrets hidden just beyond the veil of the ordinary. It was as if there were layers to life, things unseen, waiting to be discovered. It was both thrilling and terrifying to consider. My mom laughed it off, dismissing Granny's stories as fanciful tales from an older time, but I found comfort in the idea that maybe there was something more to life than what we could see. Something beyond the ordinary, something a little spooky. That night, after Granny's stories had settled into the air like smoke from a long-forgotten fire, I lay in the living room with my cousin Arlen. We'd slept there countless times before, but tonight felt different. The usual comfort of the familiar room-worn furniture, the soft glow of the lamp seemed to hum with something else, a current I couldn't quite touch. The shadows seemed deeper, as if they were pressing in from all sides, and the air, heavy with the smell of cedar and old wood, felt thick and oppressive, like it was holding something back. We lay there in the darkness, our eyes just beginning to close, when we heard it. A slow, dragging sound. At first, it was faint, like something heavy scraping along the floor. A moment of confusion, perhaps a trick of the wind, or the house settling before the noise came again. Unmistakable now. It was the sound of tired footsteps, dragging, like an old man stumbling through the hallway, his feet shuffling across the floor as if he couldn't muster the strength to lift them fully. The sound was methodical, deliberate, like something that had done it 1,000 times before. The air seemed to grow colder as it filled the room, and I felt my body stiffen, my heart beginning to pound. Arlen and I froze, our eyes wide, staring into the darkness. The dragging noise grew louder, closer, as if the figure was coming toward us, each shuffle of its feet echoing in the quiet, a sound that should have been comforting in its familiarity, but instead, it twisted something inside me. It wasn't right. It wasn't just an old man shuffling down the hall. It was something else. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The shadows around us seemed to press in tighter, the air thick and oppressive. We lay there, not daring to speak, hearts thudding in our chests, the room colder than it had ever been. I could almost hear the whispers of Granny's stories in my mind, the ones about the spirits she said wandered the house. "They're mostly harmless," she had said, But now, in the face of that dragging sound, it didn't feel harmless at all. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded, and the night settled back into its quiet rhythm. But neither of us moved. We didn't speak. We both knew, without saying a word, that we had heard something we weren't supposed to hear. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. The next few nights, the sound returned. It was a part of the house now, a familiar presence in the dark. It became our secret, something Arlen and I shared, something we never spoke about to anyone else. And yet, with each night that passed, it lost its terror, fading into the background like a distant memory. It was just all Draggy making his rounds. We'd joke, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter never reached our eyes. Inside, there was a gnawing discomfort, a feeling that something was always there, just outside of our reach. Then one evening, as we sat on the porch, the sound returned, but this time, it wasn't just the shuffle. We were talking about the usual nonsense when Arlen suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color. His eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me, and for a moment, I thought he might be messing with me, trying to get a rise out of me. But when I turned to look, my heart dropped into my stomach. In the dim light spilling from Granny's front door, a shadow appeared, tall and indistinct, moving slowly, dragging its feet with that unmistakable shuffle. It wasn't the wind, or a trick of the light. This was real. A presence, something that didn't belong, slipping through the door as if it had every right to be there. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The shadow moved without hesitation, as though it had done this 1,000 times, crossing the threshold and disappearing into the hallway. My stomach twisted in knots, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Arlen was staring, unblinking, his mouth hanging open, but no words came. We sat frozen, not knowing what to say, what to do. "Did you see that?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible, as though the very sound of it would make the shadow return. Arlen nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't speak, but his gaze was locked on the spot where the shadow had disappeared, as if trying to will himself into understanding what we had just witnessed. We didn't sleep in the living room that night. Instead, we huddled together in my room, too afraid to leave, too afraid to speak. The weight of the shadow hung in the air between us, heavy and oppressive, and neither of us dared to look out the window or venture into the hall. The fear that gnawed at us wasn't just from what we had seen, it was from the understanding that whatever had moved through that door wasn't human. It wasn't something we could explain, something we could ignore. Years passed, but the strange happenings at Granny's never stopped. Each visit seemed to bring a new layer of unease, as if the house had grown more familiar with us, and we with it. It was late one night, long after Granny had gone to bed, when I found myself wandering down the hall in search of a glass of water. The hallway was as dark and still as it always was at that hour, the silence stretching out like a thick blanket. But tonight, something felt different. A sense of heaviness hung in the air, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I passed the bathroom door, the light inside flickered on, off, its erratic pulses casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The light flickered so rapidly it seemed almost unnatural, like it was trying to communicate something, its erratic pulses quickening and slowing in a pattern I couldn't quite decipher. My skin prickled. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the door as it seemed to hum with a quiet energy. The bulbs overhead buzzed, flickering in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat, irregular and tense. And then, to my horror, The door slowly creaked open, inch by inch, as though someone on the other side was pushing it open just enough to let a sliver of darkness spill into the hall. It wasn't a gust of wind or the house settling, this was deliberate. The door moved of its own accord, as though something from the other side was inviting me in. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The flickering light seemed to grow more frantic, pulsing erratically like a signal or a call. It felt like it was trying to speak, but I couldn't make sense of it. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe, stretching and shrinking with the light's unpredictable flickers. It wasn't just a light. It was alive, and it was calling. My throat went dry. I wasn't alone. I could feel someone behind me, and when I turned, I saw Uncle Larry standing just behind me, his face pale, his body tense as he watched the door, too. He hadn't said a word when he followed me down the hall, but now, his presence was unmistakable. We both stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the door as it slowly opened wider. The air around us felt thick, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. "It's just one of Granny's friends," Uncle Larry said, his voice attempting to sound casual, but there was a tremor in it, one I couldn't ignore. He knew as well as I did that there was nothing casual about what was happening. We didn't go any closer. We didn't dare. The door continued to open, and the light kept flickering in time with our racing hearts. We slowly backed away, our eyes never leaving the bathroom door, and retreated to the kitchen, where the dim light offered no comfort. The door kept moving in the periphery of our vision, as though something or someone was waiting for us to make a move, to get closer. We sat in the kitchen, the seconds stretching into hours. The house felt suffocating, the silence so deep it rang in my ears. I could still feel the pull of that door, the way the shadows seemed to twist and curl in the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind the door was still watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. When we finally returned to the living room, hoping to retreat to the safety of the familiar, we found Granny sitting in her favorite chair, rocking slowly back and forth. The dim light from the lamp cast a soft glow over her face, but her smile was different. It was knowing. "Did you have a nice chat?" she asked softly, her voice almost too calm, too serene. I couldn't speak. My mind raced with questions I didn't know how to ask. How long had Granny known about this? How many times had she seen the same thing, heard the same things? Why did she always seem so calm, as if she had already made peace with the things that lurked in the shadows of the house, while we were still terrified of them? That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of the flickering light, the slowly opening door, haunted me. My thoughts twisted and spiraled, each flicker of light in the dark hallway replaying in my mind, faster, sharper, until I could almost hear it in my ears. I could feel the cold of the hallway creeping back into my bones, and I wondered, for the first time, what it was that Granny knew. She was never frightened. She never seemed to worry about the spirits that passed through the house, the ones she referred to as her friends. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something darker, something deeper, than I could ever hope to understand. What was really going on in that house? What had I missed? Even now, when I walk down a quiet hallway or pass an empty room, I can still hear it. That slow, dragging shuffle, the unmistakable sound of feet dragging along the floor in the dark. It haunts me, whispers through my thoughts like a memory I can't shake. And every time I hear it, I wonder if it's all draggy, or if it's something else, something older, something that's been waiting all these years to show itself again. And I wonder, as I stand frozen in the dark, If I'll ever be brave enough to find out.